suite of adaptations that allow them to endure the challenges of winter in a state of dormancy. Hi everyone, this is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. If sleeping through half the year sounds appealing to you, then look no further than your local hibernator. Hibernating animals weather extreme famine. Some tolerate body temperatures below the freezing point of water, yet don't experience cell damage. Still others descend underwater, where they forego breathing air for months at a time. Hibernation is a fascinating survival strategy, and scientists are slowly unraveling its secrets. During today's broadcast, we'll explore the different forms of hibernation as it relates to bears, ground squirrels, and turtles. We'll speak with scientists who are actively studying hibernation in these animals, and we'll discuss why it is important to not only help us conserve, and why the study of this is important to not only help us conserve wildlife, but also to improve human health. And if you have questions about hibernation, please drop those in the chat below the live camera feed. And during the broadcast, I'll do my best to try to answer as many of those as I can. To begin though, let me introduce you to the largest and perhaps the most famous of hibernating animals. When I walk through the woods near my home, I'm consistently distracted by animal tracks. The runways of snowshoe hares moving between thickets, the cloven prints made by moose and deer, and the trails of martens and fishers as they bound through the woods looking for prey. Yet there's one animal absent in these trackways in winter, an omnivore that survives on the bounty of summer. Tucked safely within their dens, bears hibernate through winter using some of the most remarkable adaptations of any mammal. Compelled by instinct and guided by the knowledge of their previous experiences, brown and black bears spend summer and fall seeking the most calorie-rich foods. In the final weeks before hibernation, they will eat tens of thousands of calories per day. It's a purposeful strategy to become seasonally obese and survive winter's famine. Well endowed with fat reserves, bears retreat to dens as cold temperatures and a lack of food make survival increasingly untenable for such a large omnivore. Inside the den, bears fast without eating, drinking, or even urinating or defecating. Over a period of several weeks, a bear's body temperature declines by 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Many of its organs, including the kidneys, are almost completely shut down. A hibernating bear experiences a heart rate so low, with so little blood circulating through its arteries, that a person experiencing the same condition would die. Overall, its metabolism slows by more than 2/3 compared to summer. Fat is the fuel that permits a bear to survive hibernation. Metabolizing fat produces the body heat and water that is necessary to keep the bear warm and hydrated. Fat also provides a mother bear with the energy to produce the milk that is needed by her newborn cubs. Although body fat is a clean-burning fuel for a hibernating bear, it still faces several physiological challenges. Despite their reliance on body fat, hibernating bears continue to utilize some lean tissue. Even with limited movements, they will burn muscle, and this creates waste products that can poison the animal. Without exercise or an incoming stream of calcium, we would also expect their bone density to significantly decrease. Yet hibernating bears are not poisoned by their own metabolic wastes, and they remain healthy without exercise. While hibernating, bears recycle their metabolic waste and transform it into usable protein, which they then incorporate back into lean tissue. They maintain their bone health by conserving calcium in their bodies through the expression of different genes that influence bone growth, and they may possess the ability to suppress the mechanisms that control bone turnover. If a bear suffers from a broken bone or wound, it can even heal those injuries while in the midst of hibernation. In spring, after their months-long fast, bears exit the den much leaner than the previous fall, yet they retain their health. If we can unlock the adaptive secrets of bear hibernation, then bears may provide us with novel treatments for some of humanity's most chronic and frustrating health problems, such as kidney disease, heart disease, and osteoporosis. Understanding how bears stay healthy while resting for months at a time could help those of us who suffer traumatic injuries or long-term illnesses to maintain our muscle and bone health while our movements are restricted. Let's face it, many of us have considered sleeping through a stressful time. And that's what bears do. They aren't avoiding the stress of world events or politics, but the stress imposed by their environment. The hibernating bear is a physiologic and metabolic marvel, a survivor with the resiliency to endure great famine and maintain good health. While bears possess some remarkable adaptations that help them to survive winter, hibernation is not a universal experience for bears. To learn more about the blend of traits and behaviors that polar bears utilize to survive winter, I spoke with Dr. Alysa McCall, the Director of Conservation Outreach and a staff scientist for Polar Bears International. Because polar bears demonstrate that there is no one-size-fits-all model for survival in the bear world. Alysa, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Mike, for having me.
I'm looking forward to you sharing your expertise with me about polar bears in the winter and how their ecology and their hibernation physiology may differ from brown bears, which I'm more familiar with. With an important exception that we'll talk about in just a few moments, polar bears are active year-round. So what's the motivation for them to stay active in winter versus like a brown or black bear that right now, like a black bear in my forest behind me, is tucked safely in its den?
Well, in a lot of ways, polar bears are the polar opposites of black and brown bears when it comes to foraging. They are looking for food in the winter. So the winter is really the big time of year where polar bears are finding their food. They're hunting seals out on the sea ice, which of course forms in the winter, and it's their smorgasbord time of year. So they don't want to sleep through that.
And while most polar bears remain active all year, a subset will not. So who are the polar bears that use dens and why are they doing so?
The only polar bears that really use dens are the pregnant females, and they're going into their dens to give birth to their cubs over the winter. And they will go into their dens in about the late fall and come out in the spring, just in time to still get some good feeding in before the summer.
And can you be a bit more specific about maybe the timing of when they go into their dens? So when does that happen, and what might their bodies experience, during that time when they're in their dens?
Yeah, absolutely. So polar bears do live across the circumpolar Arctic, so it will vary a little bit when they go into their dens, depending on where they live and what type of substrate they're digging their dens into. So many polar bears dig into coastal snow areas. Some in Greenland dig into icebergs, and some around Hudson Bay, for example, actually dig into the earth, into the peat. And have like earth dens that then get covered in snow. And generally, they'll go into their dens around late October, early November, and they're going to really hunker down and just rest for a while. They are conserving their energy as much as possible, and their core body temperature will drop to a certain extent. They are giving birth approximately late November to mid-December. There's quite a range depending on where we look. Scientists assign all polar bears a birthday of January 1st just to make it easier for us. And then after the mother gives birth, the family's still being very chill, still conserving energy. She's nursing her cubs, which takes a ton of energy and her body fat to do so. And her cubs are getting bigger, and they're getting used to their legs. And when they're ready to walk a little bit more and they're a little bit stronger in about late February, March, sometimes even a little later, depending on where they are, then the mom will burst out of the den. Usually they hang out at the den for a few days, again, to get the cubs used to being polar bears and using their legs. And then they'll go out and they'll look to hunt seals as soon as possible. And depending again on where they are in the Arctic, in Hudson Bay, they might have to walk 100 kilometers to the sea ice. But in a lot of areas in the Arctic, they might be right there. They might be right on the edge of the sea ice, and they'll go out and look for seals right away.
And brown and black bears are able to maintain their bone, organ, and muscle health during their hibernation cycle. So do denning polar bears have this ability? And if so, can you elaborate a little bit on those mechanisms?
Yeah, I can elaborate a little bit. I think that maybe brown and black bears hibernation is studied a little bit better than pregnant female polar bears just because of the sensitivities around denning mothers, but we know a little bit. One cool thing about polar bears is, of course, they are a fat-eating bear, and they're one of the biggest, they are the biggest bear on Earth, and body fat is the name of the game for them. So when mother polar bears go into their dens, they have an incredible amount of body fat to be able to sustain them for up to an 8-month fast while they're nursing their cubs and expending a lot of energy. So their body eats its own fat, of course, while they're in their den. And this helps prevent muscle loss and bone loss. And they're metabolizing their own fat for water, so they don't need to drink. So they are able to stay pretty darn healthy in there. We do see a little bit of muscle atrophy, but that muscle atrophy is comparable to other bears that have gone through a period of less activity. So muscle degrades when we're not moving or we're not using it. And it can also degrade when your body needs it for energy. And so what the loss we see in pregnant females is similar to the loss we see in polar bears who in the summer aren't as active and not eating as much. So it's very similar. So in that way, pregnant female polar bears, even though they're going 8 months without eating in a lot of cases, they are, keeping a lot of their muscle mass, which is a really great evolutionary trait to have.
And we're seeing that the ice-free season in the Arctic is expanding over the last several decades, and it's going to continue to expand as global temperatures rise. So do polar bears utilize any of these hibernation-like adaptations to survive, the ice-free period in late summer and fall? For example, can they adjust their metabolism to deal with a scarcity of food?
We used to think they could. We kind of just assumed that this is what was going on. Again, they do go through a period of less activity in the places that we monitor during the summer, and we kind of thought this must mean their metabolism ramps down a little bit, but recent research has shown that actually they're not adjusting their metabolism. They are conserving energy by, again, moving less, but what we're seeing, the weight loss that we see is just what you would expect from your average metabolism that you have anytime. So polar bears lose, up to a kilogram of body weight a day when they're on land not eating. That's what we see in Western Hudson Bay. And if they had a metabolic function that would kind of get them into a semi-hibernation state, or what we used to call walking hibernation, we would expect they wouldn't lose this much weight. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem that polar bears really can adjust their bodies and their metabolism for these longer ice-free periods.
And to bring this back to mother polar bears in particular, those that will utilize dens, how is a warming climate affecting them? Many of these, you mentioned some of these mother bears have to fast for 8 months at a time. So how is the lack of sea ice affecting maybe their ability to reproduce and care for their cubs?
Yeah, mothers and cubs are really the most vulnerable polar bears in the population. From the very start, it's just harder for females to maintain a pregnancy if they're not able to get fat enough. And they get fat enough when they have a lot of ice and a lot of access to seals. So in years where we've seen less sea ice and less access, we see female polar bears not be as productive. In Hudson Bay, the last 3 years have been very good for sea ice. And as a result, we saw a mother with triplet cubs this year, which we haven't seen for ages. But again, in years where the sea ice isn't as good, we don't see as many cubs. Mother polar bears need so much body fat, again, to survive these long fasts while they're nursing and taking care of their cubs. They really need to get to a certain level of fat before they can be successful. And we're seeing that become harder for them. So as a result, we are seeing in many areas fewer cubs, smaller cubs. And a major impact we've also seen, kind of bigger picture, is in certain areas, again, lack of access to denning regions that are or were the preferred areas. So for example, in the Beaufort Sea, about 2/3 of the polar bears there used to actually den out on the sea ice. But as the sea ice retreated farther and farther offshore and is moving around a lot more, it became less ideal denning habitat because it was less stable. So now only about 1/3 of the polar bears den on the ice, whereas 2/3 are now denning on land. And in Norway, for example, there's Hopen Island, which was a very famous, very productive denning habitat for pregnant polar bears. It was just, this haven of polar bear pregnancies. It was amazing. And polar bears don't have access to it anymore. The sea ice is no longer building up to to that island in time. So females can't even get there to make dens. So now there's no more denning on there just a few decades later. So this access to dens is a major issue. And in Hudson Bay, because there's the permafrost and the peat dens, we are worried. And we've seen a little bit of these dens collapse as the permafrost thaws. And we're also concerned even about increased wildfires. Who would think increased wildfires affect polar bear denning? But in some areas of the world, it does. So yeah, all these changes are affecting mothers and cubs. And that's why we're concerned with protecting the families, especially for polar bears.
Well, it's amazing and incredible, really, to think about polar bears as like the winter bear. I mean, some of these bears in the past, especially, may have lived their whole lives on sea ice, born in a den in the ice under the some snow cover, and then if they're a male bear, coming out and maybe never going into a den again. So quite incredible animals. And this has been a fascinating conversation, Alysa. Polar bears, to me, really demonstrate that winter needn't be a time to avoid the weather as long as you're adapted and capable of finding food. But polar bears haven't completely shed their need to den. Secure denning sites are essential for female bears to give birth and protect their newborn cubs. And during that time, polar bear moms, stay healthy by utilizing some of the, same metabolic and physiologic adaptations that allow their brown and black bear cousins to hibernate through winter. So I'd like to thank you again, Lisa, for taking the time to join me today and sharing your expertise about polar bears in winter.
Thanks, Mike. I always love talking about polar bears, especially moms and cubs. So I appreciate the chat today.
And that was Alysa McCall with Polar Bears International, a nonprofit dedicated to conserving polar bears in the wild and the sea ice that they depend on. So if you want to learn more about polar bears, please visit their website at polarbearsinternational.org. There was actually a question that came in during the conversation that I was having with Alysa about hibernation in bears in general. So I'm going to take just a moment to try to answer that one here. I was asked, is there any information on survival strategies in brown and black bears living in areas that continue to have food sources through the winter? And there is actually, what's one of those fascinating things about bears is that, as Alysa was discussing, if you got food, if you're a bear, you can survive winter, you can remain active. And so in areas of North America where bears have access to food year round, finding that increasingly, numbers of bears are staying active in year round. It happens in Florida, happens in much of the coastal plain of the Southeast United States. It happens in the Big Bend region of Texas. I actually was at Big Bend National Park a few years ago in January, right around this time of the year, and I saw a black bear feeding on pine nuts up in the Chisos Mountains. And then also in parts of California as well. California is getting hit with a lot of precipitation right now. So, the time for plants to start to green up is, coming very soon, and bears can find a lot of, herbaceous vegetation to feed on at a time of the year where the rest of, much of North America at least is covered in snow. You're not going to find black bears, for example, active in my part of Maine at this time of the year. There's just not forage available to them. But in areas where bears can find food in the winter, they can remain active, especially adult males that are not dependent on having dens to give birth and nurse their cubs through that very vulnerable period of time after those cubs are just born. And then even on Kodiak Island in Alaska, brown bears, there are at least a few brown bears, a handful of them each year, that will remain active. Their metabolism is probably still pretty low. The observations of them, from what I've read, suggest that they're pretty sluggish at that time. But the Kodiak Islands kind of stuck out there in the Pacific a ways, so it experiences a much milder climate than what other parts of Alaska typically experience. So yes. There's some information out there on the winter active brown and black bears throughout North America, but the two main conditions for that to happen would have to be a relatively mild climate and access to food. And bears are amazing creatures in many ways, but I want to take a moment to transition our conversation about hibernation towards something smaller than bears. Bears couldn't survive hibernation like a small mammal. In the dead of winter, from the coast of Hudson Bay in Canada, and then westward across Alaska and the Bering Strait into eastern Siberia, right now Arctic ground squirrels hibernate with body temperatures near and even below the freezing point of water. They are frozen yet alive. They are creatures supremely adapted to survive a long, cold Arctic winter. And the Arctic ground squirrel is also a particularly interesting species to study due to its small size and remarkable adaptations. To learn more about ground squirrel hibernation, I spoke with Dr. Sara Rice, a hibernation scientist at the University of Alaska's Institute of Arctic Biology. Sara's research includes the study of ground squirrel hibernation in the pursuit to unlock their metabolic and physiologic secrets. Sara, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So I want to jump into these questions because I find ground squirrels to be a pretty interesting critters, surviving largely on their body fat during the wintertime. But can you introduce us to your study subject overall? Can you give us a glimpse into the life of an Arctic ground squirrel?
Yeah, definitely. So what happens is they wake up in the springtime and they almost immediately mate. They raise their young in the summer, and I think things start to get really, really interesting in the fall time. So they start to gain huge amounts of fat. In fact, they just become these little morbid obese balls. There's some videos out there on the internet. I've talked to a few folks who've even found these animals stuck in rocks just because they're so fat. And then they fall into hibernation. And our animals are special. They're hibernators all over the world, but the Arctic ground squirrel are kind of special because, like you mentioned, that can actually take their body temperature below freezing. But what also makes them special is the duration which they hibernate. So they can hibernate for 8 months out of the year without eating, with pretty much being inactive, purely living off of fat with no ill effects, no muscle loss, no injury. And that's just astounding. But hibernation is pretty cool for a lot of other different reasons too.
And what makes them so interesting to study in regard to hibernation? I mean, you were just, kind of hinting at some of those really unique aspects of their hibernation.
Yeah, so I think, if you take a human and you don't give them any food and you don't let them be active at all, they'll start atrophying muscle quite a bit. But hibernators, not just the Arctic ground squirrel, all sorts of hibernators are inactive while fasting and they don't lose muscle mass. And so they're resilient to this, and we don't entirely understand how they do that, but they're also resilient to all sorts of types of injury. So when these animals get super, super cold, so they fall into hibernation, and there's a state we call torpor, where their heart beats maybe 5 times a minute, and they breathe maybe once a minute, and their whole metabolism reduced about 98%. And in this state, their blood flow is really, really slow. Yet there's no damage to their organs or their brain, even though everything's super cold and super slowed down. So that's an amazing adaptation. There's just all these small things that they do that if you did them to a human, there'd be injury. Their heart beats differently. There's no heart attack. There's lack of blood flow to their brain, but there's no stroke. So there's something very special about these animals.
So how are they able to tolerate body temperatures that are near or even below the freezing point of water?
That's actually still partially a mystery. We don't fully understand it. So what people did it in the 80s. In the 80s, people, specifically a guy named Brian Barnes, stuck some transmitters in wild Arctic ground squirrels in the belly, and he took them out and he realized these animals could actually take their body temperature below freezing. That was a first for mammals. But then what he later realized, and other people realized, is that there's some differences in temperatures in the body when they hibernate. So when they get super cold, the belly might be below freezing, but if you measure around the neck, it's a little bit warmer. And so these animals do something really special. Is they kind of wrap their heart and internal organs and the base of their brain in something called brown adipose tissue. And brown adipose tissue is a fat that basically puts out heat. And so basically it's protecting their brain and really critical organs when they're super, super cold. But people did some follow-up studies trying to figure out, how that worked, and for the rest of the body being below freezing. And part of how that works is they super cool their blood so it doesn't freeze or crystallize. But there's a lot of other little adaptations these animals do to basically protect themselves from the cold. For example, hibernators all over the world basically preferentially eat polyunsaturated fatty acids before they fall into hibernation. So polyunsaturated fatty acids are things like omega-6s or omega-3s when you think of like fish oil or something. And they pack their cellular membranes with these fats that are kind of kinky and a little bit different from other fat. And what this allows them to do is they can be fluid at colder temperatures. So basically they're protecting all their cellular membranes from that deep, deep cold, so they can still function and still allow all these proteins and transporters in their cells to work when they're really, really cold.
So they're able to, you know, protect their cell membranes. However, what about their muscle health? You mentioned that as something that they're able to do, even though they're not getting exercise. We end up laying down in the bed for weeks at a time. Our muscles are going to become quite weak over that period of time. So how are Arctic ground squirrels able to overcome that obstacle?
So it's a few different things, and there's a lot we still don't know. So keeping up muscle mass is really a balance between degradation and building. So things that break down and things that build back up. And there's been debate in the hibernation community about exactly how they do this. And there's debate about the extent to which they preserve muscle. So some people think that they atrophy a little bit, and other people say they don't. But overall, there's general consensus in the hibernation community that they retain their ability to function as well as the mass. So part of it has to do with they kind of are able to synthesize more muscle during those interbout arousals, we think, which allows them to basically compensate for any breakdown. And another part of it is basically recycling nutrients, which is what I study. The idea is that these animals fast and they purely live off of fat. But you or I, everyone needs more than fat to live off of. We need protein to actually build things in our body. For example, everything from the heart to the skeletal muscle to the liver is built off of protein, which is made up of amino acids. And so you need to be able to recycle that somehow. And so people have studied nitrogen recycling for a long time in animals with a hypothesis that basically it supports muscle health in the body.
Well, that's quite fascinating. And one of the interesting things that they'll do during the wintertime is they'll undergo those periodic warming bouts that you mentioned. So be in torpor for several weeks, and then all of a sudden their body temperatures spike back up to sort of active levels. You know, what might the function or purpose of that warming be?
Yeah, so most animals that hibernate, excluding bears, do that thing where they're in this really, really cold state for weeks at a time and then they wake back up. And when they wake up back up, we know there's a huge amount of benefit to that. So they do all sorts of things. So we know they synthesize protein during that time. We know that they dream. We know that they completely reorient their whole metabolism. So they produce a whole bunch of glucose and other things. They also do things like release immune cells. And so there are all these really good things that happen during those interbout arousals. There's a huge amount of debate about what the initial signal, which induces that arousal, is. But the thing that's fascinating is, you know how all these animals build up all this fat during the fall time and they live off that fat in hibernation. Most of the fat that they need, most of the energy they use are for those interbout arousal periods. So it's about 87% of their energy they use for the entire winter is purely spent to wake up during those interbout arousals. So there's a general consensus in the hibernation community that, yeah, they're essential to make hibernation function. But the thing is, they wake back up and then they just fall right back into hibernation, back and forth and back and forth. And yeah, it's very, very curious.
These creatures are quite remarkable in so many ways, existing in a way that humans cannot. And why is it important to study hibernation in ground squirrels? I mean, they are, for people who don't live in Alaska, they are kind of like an obscure animal. They you know, to be honest. But so why you know, take you know, the effort to learn more about how they're doing, how they're surviving?
Well, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir is that I think there's a huge value in studying animals in the natural world. A lot of times I'm a biochemist too, so in biochemistry we study mechanisms that go wrong in disease or disorder. And you know, if you kind of turn that idea on its head and look at a different perspective, if you look at animals in the wild, they've figured out how to adapt to things that we don't understand. You know, these animals have adapted to not have muscle loss or not have brain injury during extreme blood flow changes. And understanding that can teach us a lot about the world. You know, there are animals that do all sorts of incredible things, I'm sure you're aware of. There are sharks that live up to 400 years, and there's animals that migrate over huge amounts of space. And I think it just makes us understand the world better if we can understand these creatures more.
Very well put. Yeah, I concur wholeheartedly. There's so much that these animals could teach us about not only themselves, but how, perhaps those tricks that they possess could be adapted to humans, sometime in the future. So Sarah, it's been a fascinating conversation with you today. I certainly learned quite a few things about Arctic ground squirrels and hibernation that I did not know before. If you want to learn more, if you're sitting at home and you want to learn more about hibernation and the work that Sara and her colleagues do at the Institute of Arctic Biology, please visit their website at www.iab.uaf.edu. Sara, once again, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that was Dr. Sara Rice from the University of Alaska's Institute of Arctic Biology. So thanks again to her for sharing her insight on the amazing abilities of the hibernating ground squirrel. We're going to transition to another animal here in just a moment and talk about its amazing hibernative abilities. But before we get to that, I want to try to tackle a couple of questions that did come in. And they're sort of tangentially related to ground squirrels. I think they're maybe mostly referring to bears. But the first one that I want to try to answer is there future research projects planned on the Katmai bears during hibernation? And a lot of our viewers are familiar with the bear camps in Katmai National Park. And if you're not familiar with those, please check those out. They'll be going live again in late June this year, mid-June, sometime around there. We'll be able to see brown bears feeding on salmon. So it's a very highly observed population of bears, but we really don't know hardly anything about what they're doing in the winter. We kind of know what their denning habitat is like, but that's about it. And I'm not aware of any research projects specific to those bears that focus on their hibernation. So I'll have to contact the rangers at Katmai and see if I can follow up on that. But one of the things that question got me thinking, though, about how difficult it is to study bears in captivity. And if you really want to study like their hibernation physiology, you kind of have to have them in a captive setting where you can control some of the variables about their diet, have easy access to them if you need to take blood samples, for example. And there are really just a handful of places in the world that do this sort of research. One is Washington State University. They have a bear research center there, and a lot of really fascinating research has come out of there about the hibernation physiology of grizzly bears and brown bears. So that's one place where you can look up and you can read a lot about their research. But ground squirrels, though, they're kind of little bundles that you can hold in your hand. So they're a bit easier. These small hibernating mammals are a bit easier to study in captivity. And some of the tricks that they use to survive hibernation may be applicable to, human, applying those things to improve human health in the future. And another question that came in was, it's been a pretty cold winter in Alaska this year. Will this affect how long bears stay in their dens? And well, it could, but maybe only by a few weeks or so. There seems to be some evidence that bears will go into their dens earlier when the weather turns cold. I kind of think of that as maybe like a chicken or the egg sort of deal, because when cold temperatures arrive in Alaska and across much of North America, that weather coincides with a precipitous drop in food availability for a lot of bears. But there are bears in the Yukon, for example, that feed on salmon in December, and they're experiencing temperatures well below 0 Fahrenheit. So again, if you have food available, you can't stay active year-round. There is the very famous bear 399 in the Grand Teton area of Wyoming that was active into late December this year. So, bears aren't necessarily, again, avoiding cold when they go into their dens. They're avoiding famine. And that brings me really sort of to the last question that's in our queue just for the moment. And if you have additional questions, please drop those in the chat, and the moderators from Explore will try to send those my way. But the last one that I have here is, could people who feed wildlife harm their hibernation abilities? And it's possible, I guess. I just have to speculate. I'm not aware of any specific studies that take a look at the diet of animals that receive supplemental feed from people, whether that's on purpose or accidental through just like maybe leaving trash outside, for example. But as Sara was mentioning during our conversation, ground squirrels will eat a diet that's really high in certain types of fats, those polyunsaturated fats. So if they're getting, and this probably, I imagine, could probably happen with a bear too, if they're getting, a set of nutrients that's not helpful for them to gain fat reserves, and that may impact them negatively when they're trying to hibernate. So bears really seek out high fat and high sugar diets in the fall. If they end up eating like a high protein diet, for example, that's not going to really help them to build the fat reserves they need to survive. It's really good for their muscles, but it's not good for their fat reserves. So yeah, the best food for animals is wild food that they can find in nature. So if you want to encourage wildlife around your homes, and the best thing to do really is to make sure that they have access to natural habitats and native food sources. So try to landscape your yard or your property with that in mind. And ground squirrels, they endure much of the winter, as living icicles, really. But the majority of hibernators aren't mammals. They're not bears. They're not ground squirrels. The year-round survival of amphibians, reptiles, and turtles throughout much of North America really is dependent on their ability to deal with cold temperatures during winter. So as cold-blooded creatures, the body temperatures of turtles, for example, vary with the external environment. Summer might provide turtles with the warmth necessary to remain active. But what about winter? How do turtles in North America, or in the northern United States and southern Canada to be more specific, how do they meet winter's challenges and survive periods of prolonged freezing temperatures? How do they breathe while living under the frozen surface of ponds, lakes, and rivers? To explore the abilities of turtles to survive winter, I talked with Dr. Jackie Litzgus, a biology professor at Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada, and a specialist in the ecology of turtles. Jackie, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
I've always had a fascination with turtles myself. I love watching them in the wild. Anytime I see one, I stop and I pause for a few moments to consider what that turtle is doing, maybe what species it is, if I can identify it. I never got into the serious study of turtles, though, from a professional perspective. So I'm wondering, what led you to study turtles?
Well, I can say that I've had this really great, rare privilege that I could turn sort of my childhood fascination into my career. So you talked about going out and looking at turtles and being fascinated. I did that as a kid too, but then I learned that I could actually turn that into a career, and I could do science as my career on these turtles and the snakes and the other things I loved. And it came out of going out to the creek with my brother and catching these animals and observing them, and then having the opportunity to teach about them at an outdoors camp to a bunch of children, which just sort of solidified my desire to learn more about these animals and contribute in a scientific way.
And right now I'm standing outside. I'm in northern Maine right now. You're in Ontario. It's cold, right? So how does cold affect an animal like a turtle, an animal that isn't warm-blooded like us? So what challenges does it pose for them versus a mammal like ourselves?
Right. So, a turtle's body temperature is going to track the temperature of the environment, right? It's going to, if it wants to warm up, it goes and basks, as you mentioned at the start. But when it's cold out, it doesn't really have a choice but to let its body temperature fall in parallel to how the temperatures around it fall. And so if you think about a Maine winter or a northern Ontario winter here, those temperatures can get down to like minus 25 degrees Celsius, maybe even approaching minus 40 Celsius, which is when Celsius and Fahrenheit start to collide, right? So it gets pretty cold. And these temperatures are a challenge for the turtles. They can't handle being frozen. So they need to find places to spend the winter that prevent their bodies from reaching freezing temperatures. And they do that by going to ponds, going to wetlands that stay liquid during the wintertime.
And how does turtle hibernation overall then, if they're under the water, differ from what we would classically consider, to be hibernation in mammals?
Right. So when a turtle goes into a wetland, it's choosing a place that's going to protect it in terms of temperature. And when a mammal chooses a hibernation site, it's also finding a place that will protect it from real extremes of temperature. But, a mammal, they can let their body, a true hibernating mammal, which there aren't a lot of, but a true hibernating mammal can let its body temperature decrease by quite a bit, but not like a turtle could. No mammal could survive the constant low temperature that a turtle could survive. But again, turtles need to choose a proper site to make sure they don't freeze, because they can't survive if there's ice in their body cavity. So they choose a place. If you think about what happens in a pond or a wetland in winter, the temperature stratifies in the water. At the top where there's an ice cover, it's about 0 degrees Celsius. But down at the bottom of the pond, it's about 4 or maybe 3 degrees Celsius. And we found that the turtles move around and find the coldest pockets just above freezing to spend their winter. So their body temperature stays sort of steady just at that little bit above freezing temperature.
And can you walk us a little bit through what a turtle experiences under the ice of a pond, for example? I mean, you just mentioned temperature, but what about the other conditions that they're experiencing, such as water flow or light levels, interactions with other animals that they might have?
So one of the things about being in a pond that's capped with a lid of ice over the winter time is that there's no new sources of oxygen coming into that wetland over the winter. And of course, turtles do need some level of oxygen for some period of time during that winter. They can't come up and get a breath of fresh air because there is this lid of ice over the top of the pond. But they can pick up oxygen from the water column, or they can, so there's a low oxygen condition. They can switch to anaerobic metabolism, where they don't need oxygen to metabolize, is another strategy they can use. In terms of light, there's not a lot of light because there's snow cover typically as well over top of that ice. So it's pretty dark down there. And we have done some investigations in the wild in winter where we've actually augured holes. We used an auger, like an ice fishing auger, and drilled a hole in the ice to try and get a view of what the turtle is doing down there. And most of the time, they're just standing down there on the substrate. And in fact, when we open the hole, we open up the top, sometimes they poke their heads out and look at us. So they're alert, they're awake, which is also maybe a bit different than what a mammal is doing when they're in a true hibernation and they're sort of, very out of it.
And you mentioned that, there's not really oxygen coming into the pond itself in the wintertime, and turtles need to breathe air. So how are they able to survive underwater for so long without breathing?
Right. So one of the things that turtles can do is switch the way they pick up oxygen. So they can't go up and get a breath of air and use their lungs, but there are other highly vascularized surfaces in their body across which they can pick up oxygen from the water, because the water has dissolved oxygen in it as well. So one of these places is their cloacas, or their butts. It's a highly vascularized surface, and so they can pick up oxygen from the water across that surface. And because they're so cold, their metabolism is very low. So their oxygen demands, their energy demands are also really low at that time. So often that's a sufficient amount of oxygen to keep them going for the 100 days or so that they might be trapped under that lid of ice without access to aerial oxygen for breathing.
And I'm curious about your research. How are you going about the study of turtles in winter? It's difficult enough to see under ice. I mean, it's cold up above, and then you have to figure out how to track the turtles or maybe see them underneath the ice. So how do you perform your research and documenting the ecology of turtles in winter?
So, backing up just for a second, something I think that's so important to point out about wintertime in Ontario and in Maine and other northeastern locations is winter is half the lives of these animals. So we need to understand half the lives of the animals if we want to truly protect them. And turtles as a group are very much endangered on a global scale. So it's important to understand what's going on for this half of the year. So the main tool that we use is something called radiotelemetry. So VHF radio transmitters are glued, one is glued to the shell of a turtle, and then you have a receiver and an antenna, and each turtle basically has a radio station. So you dial in the radio station of that turtle's transmitter, and you use your antenna and your receiver, and you track the signal of the turtle. So it allows you to locate the turtle actually under the ice. And so you're standing on the ice of the pond above it and, using your telemetry equipment and locating it below you. And so typically we do that, and that's how we find out exactly where they are. And then we can quantify all kinds of variables about the wetland and stuff, and temperature and snow depth and whatnot. And then, as I mentioned earlier, once in a while, we do drill a hole in the ice and try and get some more measurements, like how much oxygen is actually in that water. What is we call it the headspace. How much liquid water is there above the turtle before it gets to the ice? And is it buried in the substrate or just standing on the pond bottom? We try to get information about that as well, so that we can, again, because they're mostly species at risk, we want to quantify these important attributes of their winter ecology so we can protect them better, considering their whole annual life cycle.
And yeah, I want to give you a chance to sort of elaborate on one of the points you just made earlier about how the turtles are living half their lives in winter, but it's a time period that maybe we don't know that much about, or it can be difficult to study, but it's a very important part of their lives to study, because globally turtles are a threatened group of animals. So how might studying turtles in winter help us to better protect their wild populations?
I think that the winter ecology aspect is actually very, very important. So under, at least from my perspective, in the Canadian situation where we have our Federal Species at Risk Act, one of the things underneath that legislation is a definition of what we call critical habitat. And those are the habitats that are essential to persistence of that species on the landscape. And so in Northern Ontario and in other northern places, the number of good hibernation sites are limited resources, right? And in fact, we see turtles using those resources together. They're so limited that you'll have multiple turtles in a single hibernation site. So being able to quantify those attributes of those places is super important if we want to protect the populations.
Well, this has all been wonderful information and quite fascinating information. The next time I see a turtle floating around in the pond, I'm going to think twice about how it's surviving the other half of the year for sure. The humble-looking turtle, I think, is a tough customer. I mean, their lineage experienced and survived the rise and fall of the dinosaurs. They witnessed the age of mammals and birds. They endured the ebb and flow of several ice ages. And right now, they're utilizing their ability to endure and hibernate through winter's difficult conditions. And as we gain more insight into them, the more amazing they become. Jackie, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Dr. Jackie Litzgus from Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada. So thanks to her for taking her time to share her knowledge about turtles in wintertime. We're going to wrap up the broadcast here in just a few moments. Before I get to some concluding thoughts that I want to share with everybody, we did have a few additional questions come into the chat recently. So let's try to tackle those right now. One is, have ground squirrels shown indications of cancerous cells during autopsies? And I don't know. That's a good question. With cancer, it seems like that shows up a lot in longer-lived animals, from what I know, like humans, for example. Bears do experience it. Ground squirrels, Arctic ground squirrels, actually have a longer lifespan than you would just assume from their body size. The smaller a mammal is, and the higher their reproductive rate, a lot of times that's an indication that they don't have a long lifespan. But Arctic ground squirrels seem to have a longer lifespan, maybe because they're hibernating animals, and that helps to preserve, a lot of their bodily functions that would normally age if they were active all year. So I'm not sure about cancer in them, but it certainly does happen in other animals that are hibernators, other hibernating animals like bears. Do we have any idea what triggers the end of hibernation in any of these animals? I can say just with bears, that it seems to be that bears have an internal sort of a circadian rhythm. And circadian really is just kind of like focused on the day, but maybe a longer term rhythm across seasons, where it just kind of feels right for them to wake up, like we wake up in the morning and get up and go about our day. So in a lot of places, bears are they're experienced when they exit their dens. A lot of times their den entrances are still covered by snow, for instance. Not always, but sometimes. So maybe an increasing amount of daylight wouldn't necessarily be a trigger for them, like it could for other animals. An increasing amount of daylight really causes a bunch of hormonal changes in animals. It can trigger, for animals that reproduce in the springtime, it can trigger those hormones. We see it with birds. That's a big factor. In my area, turkeys, grouse, they start to strut their stuff in springtime. That a lot of times is tied to the increasing amount of daylight. That's one of the big triggers that lets them know, hey, it's spring is here. It's time to to try to find a mate and start to reproduce. So with other animals, though, I'm not sure, the triggers for hibernation, what sends a bear into a den, for example, what makes it leave, those aren't completely understood. We have, more and more information as scientists are taking a closer look at this, but we don't have a really definitive answer. It's probably a combination of things. It's probably hormonal changes. It's probably like those long-term rhythms that these animals possess instinctively within their bodies. But again, we're not 100% sure. And if animals are hibernating to avoid famine, how do they know when there is food again? And I think that kind of goes back to the last question. What triggers them to exit hibernation is that they just have sort of like an internal rhythm that says, hey, it's time to wake up and get active once again. Bears in particular are really, really great at remembering where food is. They seem to have, they not only have a nose for it, but they have a mind for it. And going back to my interview with Dr. Litzgus about turtles, that was, turtles also have a memory for, individual places where they can hibernate. There was one little tidbit that she dropped into the interview talking about how there will be groups of turtles in certain places all kind of hibernating together. So I think these animals, just like people, if we were, subsisting largely off of the land like our ancestors, and some people across the world still do today, we would have a very specific memory about where to go to find berries, where to go to find fish, where to hunt certain animals. And I think, other wildlife have those same abilities as well. Okay. And then we have one final question here I'm going to try to get to. Let's see. Let me try to pull that up for everybody here. So one final question I want to try to answer. Suppose it got unusually warm for a bear for a period of time. So would a bear get up and leave its den? Maybe, not necessarily though. Again, bears experience in a lot of habitats pretty wild fluctuations in air temperatures. On the Alaska Peninsula, for example, where our bear cams are located in Katmai National Park, there can be temperatures in the wintertime that are 40 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And sometimes those temperature conditions those wild swings can be experienced within a week's time, just depending on where the air is coming from. It's coming from the Arctic, it's going to be really cold, especially if it's clear and calm. If it's coming off of the Pacific Ocean, then it's going to be much, much warmer. It can bring above freezing temperatures. So, but for the most part, animals have adapted over time to unconsciously understand that, hunkering down and remaining dormant during these hibernation periods is really the best thing to do. You can't get tricked by these warm spells. You end up getting tricked and coming out of your den too early, or getting active like, oh no, and then it gets cold again. Then what are you going to do? It can be difficult, to survive those conditions. And bears that end up getting disturbed at their den sites and leaving their dens it can certainly affect their survival rate, especially if it's like a mother with cubs. So staying in their dens, hunkering down, is really the thing that they want to do, the thing that they have an instinct to do. When they're not likely to get out of their den if there's like a warm spell. However, we are seeing in some parts of North America with winters, in a sense, getting shorter and warmer, that the denning periods of some of these animals is getting shorter as well. So certainly climate change is having an effect on that. And this has been a fun broadcast for me to talk about and learn about hibernation in animals and share that information with everybody. As we conclude the broadcast today, I want to take a moment to ponder one final question, and that is, why is it important to study hibernation? I believe strongly that science ought to be performed simply to satisfy our curiosity. Curiosity is a trait that's shared by humanity. And the urge to satisfy it has exponentially increased our knowledge of the universe over the last several thousand years. Science is a pursuit that leads to unexpected insights and discoveries. It also helps us conserve wild animals in an increasingly human-dominated world. As studies on the survival of turtles suggest, not all aquatic habitat is suitable to sustain turtles in winter. So knowing more about the conditions that they need to survive will help us to protect turtles in the wild. Knowing more about the conditions that mother polar bears need for secure dens where they can give birth will be vital in the effort to protect them in the face of a warming world. Understanding the conditions that hibernating animals endure can also serve as inspiration to protect the diversity of life. With a growing understanding of how animals survive winter in the habitats that are necessary for them to do so, we can make better decisions on how to provide wild animals with the room they need to survive. Hibernating animals endure conditions in winter conditions in amazing and incredible ways. I mean, they survive prolonged starvation, tolerate body temperatures near the freezing point of water, and yes, a few even breathe through their butts while living for months under ice. As we learned from our guests today, hibernation is a spectrum of behaviors and strategies. It represents one survival strategy for brown and black bears, and another for pregnant female polar bears. It's something different for Arctic ground squirrels, and even more so for turtles. Hibernating animals routinely achieve feats that are impossible for the human body. And that brings me to my very final point. The study of hibernation may help us combat some of humanity's most chronic and most challenging diseases and illnesses. Hibernating bears' relatively high body temperature suggests that the mechanisms they use to remain healthy may also work at normal human body temperatures. Bears and ground squirrels retain the ability to stand, even though they essentially experience bed rest for months at a time. Understanding how they do this could help those of us who suffer traumatic injuries maintain muscle and bone health while we need to heal. This ability could perhaps revolutionize space travel too, since astronauts easily lose bone and muscle mass while in microgravity. The ability of hibernating squirrels and bears to preserve the health of their organs could lead to novel ways to treat organ diseases and lengthen the lifespan of organs used in transplants. Bears also become resistant to insulin before they hibernate, but the condition eventually reverses back to normal. If we can figure out how they do that, it may help us fight and treat diabetes. Hibernating animals possess a suite of adaptations that allow them to endure the challenges of winter. They are survivors and specialists living their best life despite the worst that winter offers. I'd like to thank the guests who took their time to join me today and explore the world of hibernation. And I'd like to thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. My name is Mike Fitz. Thanks for watching. And as we like to say at explore.org, never stop learning.